and welcome to Ready for Love Radio. This is your host and love coach, Nikki Lee. Today, we're going to have part 2 of my interview with Dave Richardson, and we're also going to have Kenny Fields with us. If you were with us last week, we got a lot of information about Dave's book, Vietnam Air Rescues, and this is an unusual show for me, but it's one that I did actually about 12 years ago when I had my show where I interviewed authors, and we talked about Dave's book, how he wrote the book. Initially, he wanted to share it with his family and let them know about his experiences during the war as a air rescue helicopter pilot, and he shares information about, I believe it was 8 or 9 different rescues that he did, and the very last rescue he did was, it actually lasted 3 days, and at the time it was the largest rescue of the entire war. And I found out that he had met the man, again years later, that he rescued, and he was still in touch with him, or knew how to find him, and he had also written a book about the experience. And so I called him. His name's Kenny Fields, and he's on the interview with us today. So I'm very pleased to bring you both of them for the interview, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. And it's not our typical show, but it's really interesting, one of my favorite shows I've ever done, and I hope you'll enjoy it also. So let's get right to it.
Good afternoon. This is Nikki Lee, your host. And for the people that were here last week, Dave Richardson is back with us today, and we also have Kenny Fields with us today. Let me just give you a little background. Dave was here last week, and he wrote the book Vietnam Air Rescues. And for anybody that missed the show, you can easily go to the show page and download that so you can catch up. We talked about how the book came into being, how various family members pushed the idea that they wanted him to put it all on paper, and how he decided what information to share in the book. The rescues are a big element of the book, but he also included a lot of information to give people who weren't there and who want to understand more about Vietnam and the time over there and the people that served. He gave a lot of additional information to give us necessary background to understand the things that were happening. Out of the rescues in Dave's book, the last one was just unbelievable when you're reading. I mean, it's one of those edge-of-your-seat books that you're wondering what's going to happen next and that sort of thing. And the last person he rescued before he came home was Kenny Fields. And Kenny has actually also written a book about his experiences, so we're going to talk to both of them today. So, Dave and Kenny, how are y'all today?
Doing fine. Glad to be here again.
And Kenny's calling from North Carolina, and I'm happy to be here.
All right. You're actually close to me. I think, Dave, you're out west, aren't you?
Yeah, Kansas, smack dab in the middle.
Okay. Well, we're on the East Coast, but that's all right. We're all here together. And something we were talking about before the show, actually we started talking about a lot of stuff, but one of the things we were talking about is, where were the two of you all in your deployment to Vietnam before this happened? I think, Dave, you were almost ready to come home, weren't you?
Yes, this turned out to be my very last mission of my time over there.
Okay. And Kenny?
I was just making my first combat deployment, so on the day of this rescue, it was my first combat mission. And actually, it was the first day of operations ever for the USS America, the Navy aircraft carrier. First deployment into combat for the America, and then I got shot down on the first day, so it was a bad start.
So how many combat missions did you fly?
I flew a total of 137.
Can I steal what you told me before the show started?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there was 137 total, and how many did you fly after the rescue we're going to talk about today?
After the rescue, I flew 136.
I just think it's so great. I like that. Like I said, you told me and you said I could talk about anything, so I had to borrow that.
And I had 3 days on the ground in the jungle waiting for Dave to rescue me, trying to make up my mind whether I wanted to continue doing those missions.
I would think that would not be the time to have all that time to think about what was happening around you. And it seems like you must, the wildlife that you talk about in the book, oh my gracious, you must have met one of everything while you were out there.
It was a different Laos back then from what I've seen on the internet. You know, now most of the large animals were gone, but I actually got to see the tigers and the leopards and hundreds of monkeys all up close, right underneath their trees.
I was going to say, that one sounded like you spent the whole evening with the monkeys. Some of the information, I've been talking to Dave about your book also, Kenny. I think you actually included other people and the things that were going on for them within your book, not just what was happening to you personally. Is that true?
Yes, the book starts off with my wife and bringing my wife, and we had 2 children, and she was pregnant with the 3rd child at the time I left. So when I got shot down, she was about 3.5 months pregnant with the 3rd child. So I start off with that, and then I weave in the forward air controllers who were controlling me during my bomb runs and give their background. And the first forward air controller I was working with actually had only been in combat for about 3 weeks. And then there's a plane, an Air Force plane called call sign Sandy that escorts the Jolly Green rescue helicopters, and they several of them were the first guys to come in and try to make contact with me. So there's about 6 characters in that group that I follow throughout the book. So,
I was noticing in the notes you sent me, you've got everybody's Nail 66 and Sandy 5 and all this, and you should have seen me trying to guess who was who and compare that to Dave's book, which I'd read, trying to make sure I knew who was playing what part in the whole story here.
Yeah, that's an odd thing, because when I first sent my manuscript into the publisher, I did not use real names in the book, and one of my 3 test readers is one of the characters in my book, and he has authored 4 books at this time, and he questioned and wanted names, the real names in the book, and I used call signs because I thought it would be easier for the non-military reader to actually follow the story by just having a consistent call sign instead of bringing in a name every time.
Well, it seems like, too, it would also help you keep track of like, who was together, like Sandy 5 and Sandy 9, were part of the same group and that sort of thing. That was something that I did when I was reading through, when I could kind of keep track of who was doing what. Something you mentioned also is the competitive nature between some of the pilots in the squadron. What can you tell us about that?
In a Navy jet squadron, the border and aircraft carrier, everything is graded. Your landings are graded, and they post it on the bulletin board inside the ready room. Out of 20 pilots, you're either 6 out of 20 or 19 out of 20 or everything, and the bomb runs are all graded pretty much the same way. So it's extremely competitive, trying to get the best targets, get the most bomb damage, and make it safely back with the best carrier landing. So yeah, it's an extremely competitive environment. I've played a lot of sports throughout my life, and Dave may echo the same thing. A pilot in a squadron in combat is pretty much at the ultimate level of competition, trying to maintain his reputation, and so a lot of times you can get the pilots who might be the better pilot, but they don't have the stomach for the war part. So I think in reading my book and Dave's book, you'll get a sense that just because you're a great pilot doesn't make you a great pilot in combat. So the competition to come out of that arena with the reputation that, well, he might have been an average pilot, but he was an outstanding combat pilot because he maintained his cool.
Well, the distance is so incredibly different. I mean, just flying on normal situations is one thing, but I mean, the things that are described in these books, that's just not normal at all. And being able, like you said, to maintain your cool in this kind of situations would be something else. Plus, you've got all the other people talking, and you've got the radio, and you've got the people depending on you, and Kenny, you were on the ground watching them, and then I'm sure that it was just I can't imagine what it was, 40 hours I think it was that you were waiting on them?
40 hours, which encompassed 2 nights, and so I saw literally heard and saw hundreds of thousands of enemy gunfire rounds going up at the rescue airplanes during that 3 days. It was an amazing sight from on the ground, thinking why more airplanes weren't getting hit. We actually lost. I had 4 airplanes shot down during the rescue, and there were a total of 7 planes that were totally damaged beyond further use. So for me, sitting on the ground and, well, actually flying too, I would be interested in hearing Dave's comment about you're all excited and you go in on your first combat mission, and my first experience was seeing enemy gunfire coming up at me, tracers coming up at the airplane. My first indication was it didn't scare me too much. How about you, Dave? I mean, when I first saw the initial badge.
Well, yeah, you're right. You're so busy trying to do other things and keep your mission going. You notice them, but it's not. You don't have time to be scared. Later on, you think about it, and you are, but at the time, you're just too busy to worry about it.
Well, it's like in the old movies. You grow up seeing the movies, and all the airplanes are taking enemy fire, and the tracers are going around, the flak's bursting. So on your first first mission, when you see that, you think, well, that's what war is all about. And on my second bomb run, when they blew half of my wing off, then the reality of the fact that, hey, this enemy fire, not only, I mean, it can be, so when I went back on my second and third missions thereafter, you are a little bit more tentative and a little bit more cautious.
Yeah, you find out that stuff is real. It's not just fireworks.
That's right. It's a life and death situation. It's not just a training mission,
right.
Show anymore.
Okay, at one point, too, you're talking about the rules of engagement and how that came into play. Did you each have your own sort of rules for engagement for your missions that you flew?
I think so. I think from everything I've heard, I had a book review recently in Air and Space magazine, and the book reviewer was an Air Force F-4 jet pilot during Vietnam at the same time. And he literally hacked me off a little bit in the sense that he was a little bit critical of the fact that the Navy sent pilots in without any combat experience into a hot area on their first run. But in my squadron, there were 20 pilots, and only one pilot had previous combat experience. So it wasn't like we could sort of work into it slowly. We had to sort of learn as we went.
True. Dave, did you all have rules for engagement?
Yeah, ours were probably a little bit different than Kenny's because we weren't dropping ordnance, but basically we weren't allowed to shoot at the enemy unless they shot at us first. So I think I mentioned you're kind of counting on the enemy to be a bad shot.
I know.
Yeah,
very true.
I didn't define my rules of engagement, but if you read my book, and what the Navy pilots get upset and most about after they read my book is that my Air Wing commander took me to task and thought that I made a bad move in making a second bomb run in the midst of enemy fire after making the first bomb run. And so the rules of engagement over North Vietnam, we made one bomb run, and then that was it. It was so hot of an area, it didn't make a second one. Over Laos, where Dave and I were, our rules of engagement were if you got shot at on the first bomb run, it was okay to make a second bomb run if the forward air controller requested it and thought it was feasible. So that becomes a intriguing part of my book in deciding on my second bomb run whether it's going to be made or not. Then I make it and get shot down, so when I get back to the ship, all hell breaks loose. And the admiral aboard the ship comes to my defense and basically says that he would have done it just like I did it.
Always nice when somebody tells you that they would have done the exact same thing.
It's very discouraging in wartime, though, to be taken to task for making a bomb run.
Yeah. Well, and it seems, too, and it seems like in your notes you mentioned, too, that after you make the first bomb run, and it seems like you had a bullseye and hit exactly where you should have hit, that would have to draw more fire from the enemy, which would mean the second time through would have to be more dangerous, right?
Right. And okay. I knew that. That's a question that becomes one of, as we were talking earlier, I mean, it actually even enters your mind about, at that point, it'll quickly enter your mind about, hey, how much is this war worth? How committed am I to this war? Am I going to do this mission correctly, or am I going to wimp out a little bit and back away and play it safe? So we had talked about that ahead of time prior to our first missions on the way over to Vietnam about whether the war was worth getting killed over, whether it was worth taking chances. That's where I think Dave is such a big hero of mine, in that he had 100 missions to see all that. He knew the attitude of the country, and he literally, for 2 days in a row, put himself in a life and death situation, and he is very lucky to be alive. Being on the ground and seeing everything, they were shooting at him. So Dave made that decision, too, about whether a single guy's life was worth the lives of 4 of his crewmen, to continue to try to rescue me.
It's interesting you bring that up because we're doing this blog tour, and a couple days ago, one of the people sort of took me to task over that, and one of his questions was, he said, well, on the last mission, you had 3 days and 189 sorties and lost 7 aircraft and on and on and on, and he said, was it really worth it just for one guy? He says, when do you say enough is enough and you quit? And his last thing was it worth it? And so I wrote him an answer back, but the last thing I told him was, go ask the survivor if it was worth it.
Go ahead.
Well, the thing, too, that people forget, and I try to remind them in the epilogue of my book, is we were in the midst of 10,000 enemy troops. During the attempts to rescue me, a lot of those enemy troops were killed. And as soon as they got me out, they sent the B-52s in for massive bombing structures. So the whole name of the game, once we identified those 10,000 troops, was, it was literally worth 3 or 4 airplanes to go after 10,000 enemy troops that had fought at Quezon. So people forget the fact that rescue cost 6 or 7 airplanes, but they don't dwell on how many enemy troops were killed.
Yeah.
Well, it seems, too, as long as you were on the ground and as many missions as they flew in to try to get you out, it seems like it would have to be an awful lot of the enemy focused in that one specific area. Because, I mean, and I know in Dave's book several times he mentions how sometimes they kind of set you up. Like, somebody else will come on the radio and make it sound like it was an American that was stranded just to bring you into a trap and that sort of thing. So it seems like there had to be so many of the enemy concentrated in that area that once they got you out, they could come in and really hit the area and do some damage.
Well, the Air Force pilots were arguing back and forth, discussing mightily for 40 hours, over this 2-night period about whether I was had been captured and was being used for bait and just trying to suck the rescue forces in. On the ground, from the time I hit the ground, actually from the time my parachute popped open, I had enemy troops chasing me constantly for that 40 hours, and they were always close. So, yes, there were a lot of troops there, but I never was actually got to the point. I mean, they got within 10 feet many times, and never at the point where I thought I was going to have to surrender. So it was literally me having a big fight on the ground, but I could understand the rescue forces thinking that, hey, maybe this guy's just been used to lure us into a trap. But because I was down there, they didn't have to lure them into a trap. If they were going to rescue me, they were going to have to do it out of the midst of 10,000 enemy troops right in the center of them. So they had the rescue guys had to continue to keep trying to get through that massive force to get to me.
Let me see. In Chapter 7, you're talking about, having the people shooting as you're actually, floating toward the ground, that kind of thing. What are some things that you can share with us that were racing through your mind at that point? And I don't want to bring back any horrible memories. I'm just thinking a few of the things, because, I mean, I'm sure we all have our imagination what we'd be thinking, but
yeah, I think
what's actually going through your mind?
I think you're pre-programmed that a lot of times things pop in your mind that you never would have thought. My airplane's tumbling end over end. I eject. When the airplane's upside down, I'm rocketing toward the ground, and all of a sudden my parachute pops open, and when it popped open, the first thought that popped into my mind was, I looked down and I saw this guy in a black uniform the chute popped open about 300 feet. I heard a pop and looked down, and he had just shot at me once with the rifle, and he was pulling another round into the chamber. That all happened real quick in a flash, and out pops this thought in my mind that I'm dead or I'm going to be captured and a prisoner for 5 or 6 years, and my wife is going to have to take care of 3 kids all by herself. It was just a quick, fleeting thought. I never would have thought that in the midst of all that turmoil that my wife and family would have popped into the situation. From that point on, though, I don't think I thought more than once about the family after that. I had my hands full, but
I was right. You had plenty of other things you needed to focus on right at that point.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like we're talking about, when you're on a mission and that sort of thing. There's so many things going on that you actually don't have time to be scared. Later you have time to focus on it, but at the time there's too many other things that need your immediate attention.
Now, 5 minutes later, I was thinking that, hey, I'm a jet pilot, a combat pilot. I've just made 2 bomb runs. I've seen all this enemy fire. 5 minutes later, when I've got my first hiding spot and the enemy troops have just run by my position about 10 feet away, I sat there and I thought to myself, I'm going to be captured, because there is no way that the rescue forces in a slow-moving helicopter can get into my position and rescue me, because even in a jet I got shot down. So I heard all this enemy fire. So 5 minutes after hitting ground, I was very demoralized. I mean, it took me 10 minutes to get over the fact that I didn't think they would ever be able to get close to me. And then the first couple of guys to come in got shot down.
Right.
The first guy got hit, the second pilot, and now he was on the ground a mile away from my position. Now the next thought pops into my mind, Nikki, and this is one of the points I'm making in the book, that what is that one man's life worth? I was torn between telling the rescue forces that it's too hot for you to come get me, so don't try. And then the next moment I'd be thinking, well, it's their job. Let them try to come and get me because it's their job. So it was an up and down emotional cycle about whether to be man enough to tell the rescue forces, hey, I don't think you can do it, so don't try it.
Sandy 5? No. Which one of the ones was the one that was shot down?
The first one was Sandy 5, and he got hit and had a total crash landing back on the runway, and Dave got to observe that from his helicopter back at the base. And then the 15 minutes later, Sandy 7 came in, and he got shot down and ended up being on ground about 1 mile from me. And he immediately had a running gun battle, and I could hear that happening on the ground as he was being chased after he hit the ground. So at that point, sort of helped me because now I had one of their Air Force buddies on the ground with me, so it gave them more impetus to come and get me.
They had to divide and conquer at that point. They had two of y'all to try to chase down.
Right.
So much information. My goodness. I tell you, if y'all could see all my notes. So Dave, at which point in this story do you find out what's going on and first? And actually, you even had an out that you didn't have to go on this mission at all, right?
Yeah, it was kind of strange. What they would do is that close to the end of your tour, they would take you off about a week or so because you needed some time to wind down and get ready to get back into the world as it was. It seemed like, it might have been wrong, but it seemed like that's when people got careless and they would get themselves killed. So anyway, they took you off the flying schedule, and so I was off the schedule getting ready to go home, but they were short of, the pilot was called a rescue crew commander, and they were short of them, and so they asked if I would just do one last alert sitting at home base. I didn't have to go out and do anything just because of backup, and I said, sure, why not? And so we got in on this thing, and then as I checked...
easy when they put it like that.
Well, as I checked in Friday, just before dark Friday night, to relieve the people that had been there for 3 days, Kenny got shot down, and actually they raced out in front of my eyes and tried to get him, and they couldn't get to him fast enough. So I was sort of that was the first I knew about it, and I didn't really know what was going on. Supposedly, the word we got was, he went down an uninhabited valley, no sweat, and so everybody took off, and then bang, bang, a couple planes got shot down, and went, there is somebody there. And when Kenny was saying earlier about 10,000 troops, that's not a euphemism. That's literally true. That was the siege of Khe Sanh is a very famous thing where they almost overran the camp. And when the siege was broken, all of these troops disappeared. Nobody knew where they were. Well, Kenny found them. He landed right in the middle of them in this valley.
That's competitive nature again, huh, Kenny?
Yeah.
He knew they were missing. He said, I'm going to find them.
So the next day, Dave gets tossed into the mix, and he's actually flying out to rescue me. And in the book, the third Sandy pilot, who happens to be the first Sandy pilot who got hit and crash-landed back at base when Dave was sitting in an alert position, the next morning at 9:30, I've got a platoon of troops, a squad of troops of 10 men walking directly toward me, and I start calling for air support, and Sandy 5, who had crash-landed the day before, comes down to try to help me, and he gets shot down. The second day, after being hit the first day, he gets shot down, and Dave was one of the helicopter pilots standing by at that time, and Dave made his first rescue on that second morning. So at that point now, Dave's already been on 2 cycles since he was supposed to go home.
So on day 2, isn't that when the bad weather and the clouds and the rain and all that moved in also?
Bad weather, sitting around all day. I'm underneath a monkey tree. That's when the Leopard walks up 6 or 7 feet away from me, and the squad of men are walking across the field toward me, and then it gets on into the afternoon, and they come through with a North Vietnamese regular guy walks in with a battery, with a backpack that's directional homing equipment. He's homing in on my radio to try to find me. He gets to be about 75 feet away from me, and that's all happening in that second day. And then at the end of that day is when, in my book and Dave's book, you read about the Valley of Death, because at the end of the second day they make a massive rescue attempt. And there's 2 scenes in the movie that would make great movies: the night of the second day, and then the rescue attempt or rescue pickup on the third morning. But on the second nights, where I give Dave the most credit, they make a rescue attempt right before nightfall, and 24 planes start in, and it gets down to where there's only one plane still flying toward me, and that's Dave in his little 100-mile-an-hour helicopter. And he's all by himself, and the general is telling him to keep going. That took a lot of nerve, Dave.
That's what I can think as I was reading it.
But Dave describes it. You can let Dave describe that valley of death that he's flying toward.
Well, I'll tell you what, there was one, Sandy 5. When did Sandy 5 go down? That was a little earlier, wasn't it?
9:30 in the morning on the second day.
Okay. So he goes down, and Dave, tell me about the rescue of Sandy 5.
Well, we were able to get him out. Actually, I had been flying since about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was just about out of fuel. And so we had pulled out to do air-to-air refilling with the C-130, and I had just finished refueling, and Sandy 5 got hit. And the only way we could get him was he managed to zoom his A-1 up, and when he ejected, his parachute carried him out of the valley on the far side. And so they announced he'd been hit and asked if I was willing to give it a try, and I said sure, and we worked our way completely around the end and into another valley on the other side of where Kenny was, and managed to get in there before anybody really realized what was going on and got him out.
It seems like getting in there quickly, and I mean, I know we talked last week about, you know, the pilot in the airplane was going at 500 miles an hour, and you're coming behind him, and you're only going 100 miles an hour. You know, you've got quite a lag time, you know, to actually get to where you need to be.
Yeah, it made it sporting.
Of course, 100 miles an hour doesn't sound that slow to us that drive cars, but you know.
that rescue, Nikki, of that guy at that time is much more. It's funny actually, because parachute ends up hanging up in a tree, and he ends up falling out of the tree and knocking himself out momentarily.
Right,
so Dave
actually
had to hover over this situation with enemy troops running by on the ground, and
his getting knocked out is why y'all had such a hard time getting in touch with him, because he wasn't responding to your calls, right?
It's sort of funny in a way.
Kind of like you see in the movies, right?
Right.
Okay, so the weather's still bad. You've got the helicopters cleared to come back to base. People are needing to refuel. Everything imaginable is going on at this point. So we've got Sandy 5's been rescued. He's taken care of. Then what's happening with you, Kenny?
Well, that's when I had the 10 guys walking across the field toward me, and the Leopard coming up, and I had an encounter with a lion about 100 feet away. That actually some Pathet-Lao guerrillas shot a lion out of a tree about 100 feet behind me. I assumed they were shooting it for food, you know, but I think it was thrilling to me because I didn't know it was a lion initially, and I'm hearing gunfire just 100 feet behind me, and
right.
So I think it's probably a little bit funny in the book when you see that it actually turned out to be a lion. And so in the end, what I'm doing before darkness is it gets to the point where this guy with the radio directional finder is walking toward me, and I've got enemy troops coming from off the other side toward me. So we end up, the jets end up dropping a string of bombs that I can use as a diversion to run past all those guys. So
well, it seems like the enemy got really close quite a few times.
Yeah, they did. And it was close enough. There were multiple times when it was close enough when I could see eyeballs.
The Valley of Death.
Let me just jump in for a second. Mm-hmm. And Kenny hasn't mentioned the title of his book yet, The Rescue of Streetcar 304, and it is a tremendous book. His book is all about this one mission, and it ties together the story from everybody's point of view, and it's available on Amazon, and people really, people really need to read it to get a feel for what was going on. My book is sort of a series of vignettes about several different rescues I did, and ends up with this one, but Kenny didn't tell his title yet. I wanted to throw that in for him.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Okay, so Nikki, what happens? I end up, after these bombs are dropped, that's when I end up in the hollow tree. Mm-hmm. And I'm there. I'm sitting inside this hollowed-out tree because I've got enemy troops still chasing me. So they go by. Fortunately, they go by about 15 feet off to my left. And then I sit there for about 2 hours while I'm being told that a massive rescue attempt is going to occur at 4 o'clock. Then it's 5 o'clock, and then it's 6 o'clock, and then it actually ends up being a little after 7 o'clock when the effort's finally made. And at that time, I've got enemy troops about 10 of them, these same 10 guys are about 75 to 100 feet out in front of me. But they're planted right on the base of a hillside, where a ridge line that I needed to make it to for more cover. So at about 7 o'clock, they start in. 12 jets come in, dropping bombs and CBUs, and you're reading the book about how these CBUs go pinging around and they're exploding everywhere, and they're knocking guys out of enemies, gunners out of tree tops, etc. These bombs are exploding all around, and one of them lands right at my feet, and it turns out to be a dud. But this goes on with these 12 jets, and they're followed by 7 Sandy A-1s who are escorting 3 helicopters. And Dave is the lead helicopter in that rescue group.
Let me ask something real quick. I think you skipped past something I want to talk about real fast. Because Dave, y'all, after all the trouble you had getting in, somebody came up with the idea to use gas. But
yeah, that was.
Is that after what he's talking about?
Yeah, the days we're talking about are Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and Saturday being he was shot down Friday night, so Saturday is what we're talking about so far. And
okay.
When everything came to a fizzle or end at the end of Saturday, they're sitting around saying, some people said, just leave the guy there, it's not worth it, and other people said, no, we got to get him out. And so someone came up with this idea of using this gas, this knockout gas, that they hoped they could adapt some of the Sandys to spray the valley, and that was going to be done Sunday morning.
I thought what was interesting, and we'll go right back, I don't want to mention this before I forget about it, is the problem with that is the gas is only going to go so high. And if you have people and enemies in the trees at, say, 75 or 80-foot tall trees, the gas isn't going to get to them, which gave you even another problem that you're going to have to deal with.
Exactly.
But I will stop interrupting. Kenny, you want to go back to what you were talking about? I just want to make sure that we cover that issue, too.
One thing we bypassed here, the Air Force pilot who's on the ground with me, I talked to him a couple times on the radio on Friday night after he went down. He ends up, I'm not going to give the book away, he ends up putting himself in a position to where it turns out he's hiding right in the middle of an enemy base camp of a couple of hundred soldiers. He ends up having to stay in that position for 40 hours. So, and he refuses to talk on his radio. So there comes a point on the morning of the second day where the Air Force and I think that he's probably dead because we can't make contact with him. But there's still a possibility that he's out there somewhere. But we're still throwing bombs all over the jungle and coming close to me, and we don't know if they're coming close to him or not. But back to this second night rescue, they come in with 12 jets, and then the problem is, as you said, they come in real fast. They run away from the Sandys who are escorting the helicopter pilots, and one of the helicopters ends up overheating the transmission and has to set down on the ground. And when he lands on the ground about 10 miles from my position, enemy troops swarm out of the tree line coming after them. The second helicopter is trying to pick up that crew real fast. While that's going on, Dave is being told in his single helicopter to continue to try to rescue me, Streetcar 304. But at this point, all of his support planes have sort of left him. And so he's proceeding up this ridge line to get up to the top of a ridge to look down at the valley where I am. And I'll let Dave, it's now dark, it's twilight, it's dark inside the jungle, it's still a reddish sky out to the west, and Dave flies up this ridge and reaches the top of the mountain by himself and is being told to continue to go rescue me with no escort planes. So Dave, you tell him what you saw at the top of the hill.
Well, it was an interesting thought. Throughout my time in Vietnam, I'm a Christian, and I had felt like the Lord was protecting me, and like I had his mantle of protection around me. And as I topped the ridge that night, I felt like it had slipped off and fell on the floor. And what I looked at was I was still in sunlight up top of the valley down below was completely in shadow, and it reminded me of a few years before that I'd gone to a 4th of July celebration, and when we went in, they gave everybody a candle and a match, and they said, at a certain point, we're going to turn off the lights, and I want you to strike the match and light the candle, and it was beautiful. You flicker, 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 and a glow. Well, that's what the valley looked like from the gunfire that was coming up. And so as I started to dive in, I thought, I'm dead. I thought, there's no way we're going to go through this. And so it was a beautiful yet horrifying sight at the same time.
And Dave's got 3 guys in the plane with him, Nikki, and they're all sort of pleading, hey, we don't have to do this. We don't have to do this. Are you sure we have to do this?
Well, and Dave, explain to listeners, why do you have more than one helicopter when you go in?
Well, we always flew 2 helicopters because in case the first one got shot down, just real simply. We traded days. One day you were the low helicopter to pick up, and the next day you were the backup one. The idea was as you're flying out there, you had to fly low below the ridge lines to stay out of the SAM missile radar, and basically nobody really knew where we were. So if you were by yourself and got shot down, they didn't know where to go look for you. And the idea was we had the Sandy A-1s that protected us. So the idea was if a helicopter went down, then the second helicopter was expected to immediately rush in and rescue as many of the helicopter crew as they could. And sometimes that worked. A lot of times the enemy would be slapping themselves on the back and congratulating themselves on getting the helicopter. And if you came in immediately, you could surprise them and get the people out. And sometimes it didn't work, but at least that was the way we played the game.
Right. Well, that's why when you go in the last time and they want to send in 3 helicopters, that had to have given you a bad feeling.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, they expect us to lose 2,
Right. Yeah, I complained that night, Saturday night. They said they were going to use gas the valley, and I said, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard in my life. And I was a captain, and these were a bunch of colonels. Of course, they didn't have to fly, but a bunch of colonels were planning the mission. They had a lot of high-level interest, and so I said, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard, and they just said, never mind you. And anyway, we went back to our hooch. That was when my roommate came and bet me a nickel I wouldn't come back alive the next day. But in the morning when we got up, they said, they had a third helicopter crew. And I said, what's that? And they said, we got to thinking about it. I said, it's almost above 90% chance the first helicopter will get shot down, and we figure you're the backup this day because we switched. Said we figure it's a higher than 80% chance you'll get shot down. I said, so maybe the third one can get some of you out of there. And so that was our cheerful little thought as we took off.
I tell you, nothing like encouraging you as you take off.
Well, it makes you focus on your mission, if nothing else.
While those guys were arguing or discussing or listening, like the colonels were arguing about the mission. And by the way, this ended up being like the third. This was the largest rescue of a Navy pilot during the war, and it was like the third largest rescue of the Vietnam War for numbers of sorties and planes lost, etc. But during the night, while they were doing that, I still was being chased by bad guys, and but I had an interesting experience where I'm next to a tree in the middle of the night, and I hadn't slept at all the first night, and inadvertently I fall asleep, leaning against this tree after I had escaped this 10-man squad that was about, they had me encircled about 75 feet away when a tremendous rainstorm hit, and I got away. But while I'm sleeping against this tree, all of a sudden I feel a hand on my shoulder. And that part of the book gets the most response from readers, the most questions. The way it's written is exactly the way it happened to me, in that after the incident, even at the time, I didn't know exactly what happened and who had been there and what had happened, etc. So I wrote it that way in the book, so I get more questions about who were those guys that put their hands on your shoulder and what happened and everything. So
right.
My second night was more exciting than the first night. And then the next morning, though, I've got myself in a really pretty much of a perfect rescue point in that I'm on top of a ridge, and they can come up one side of the valley away from where most of the enemy fire is.
Is that because there was, I think at one point that we talked about the razor grass last week and how it's not something you could run through kind of thing. I think that was around some of the huts that y'all were in too between missions, weren't you, Dave?
Yeah, that was a factor in a couple of other missions that I flew on, and around our alert hut we had that.
Yeah, I was in my pickup spot. I thought it was perfect at the time because it was at more clumps of just light foliage, small shrubs that were going up about 10 to 12 feet high, but nothing real thick. But what I didn't know when I first chose that spot was that in the center of it, it was pretty much like a big blackberry vine thicket. And so I ended up having difficulty later on getting to that when the helicopters actually arrived. But I think when we're down to that third morning, when the rescue forces come in, I think that situation from what I saw on the ground is better than any movie I've ever seen. It was like I just couldn't believe it even when I was on the ground. It was like a movie script the way things were happening. I get to the point where when the rescue guys are making their final bomb runs, they actually have to make a decision on whether they're going to deliberately bomb me in order to knock out the enemy troops around me because they're so close. So I don't know to this day whether they deliberately bombed me or not, but they were trying to bomb so close to me that they actually did put a bomb on top of me that injured me badly, but it also pretty much wiped out the 10-man squad that was lined up around a tree line about 75 feet away. And actually, it's the exact spot where Dave ends up hovering to make the final rescue. He hovers right over where this 10-man squad had been before this final bomb was dropped. And actually, the bomb, after it hit, I could hear them moaning and groaning. They were pretty much decimated, but they were still alive, but I could hear them pleading for help. And in the midst of all that, after I'm hit by the bomb, they tell me, hey, the rescue helicopter is on the way. And from that point on, it became like a movie scenario.
Well, those bombs that you're mentioning, aren't those the ones that were used once they determined that the gas wasn't going to work for the people in the trees that were aiming at y'all?
Well, the bombs were CBUs, which was a cluster bomb. It's a small base, inside one bomb there's like 180 of these little metal baseballs, and inside each one of those baseballs there's a couple of hundred pellets that will spew out. And I had been trained that those bombs, if you're inside that bomb pattern, they have a 99% kill rate. And I ended up, as Dave talked about God before, I think that was the time when God was protecting me, because after that bomb hit, I set up badly injured, bleeding, and I looked around me. I mean, they were like little 2-foot diameter sections that were maybe free of bomb holes scattered throughout this area, and I was sitting right in the midst of one of them. So it was just unbelievable. When I sat up and looked around, I thought, how did I survive that? Well, I actually hadn't at that point. I had about 14 or so shrapnel pellet type injuries to my body, and I was bleeding, but at the same time, I was amazed that I wasn't dead. So I think that's when God had a hand in saving me, in the sense that there was no logical reason that I should be alive after when I saw all the bomb craters.
Right. Dave, this is the mission where you actually, once y'all got over top of him, you actually had to hold that position. Wasn't that the 4-minute time when you were holding over top?
Yeah, we got in there, and for some reason, I told the story to people, and people have read it in the book, and they've said, I don't think that really happened. And Kenny talked about a movie. I think if you put it in a movie, people say, oh, that's phony. It couldn't possibly be, but it did actually happen. When we got into the area, for some reason, I couldn't raise Kenny on the radio, or it was intermittent, and I was
dead batteries. Batteries were going dead.
I would think after 40 hours, the batteries would be getting really low.
Yeah, and the weather, the humidity and everything tended to degrade them too. I was at that point about 99% sure that it wasn't him, that he was either dead or captured, and that they were just trying to sucker us in, because I couldn't raise him on the radio, and I couldn't see his smoke. And we got into the area where he was supposed to be, and we just started hovering, and the planes were flying around, and people were shooting, and it was a great show. And I was thinking, this is stupid. I'm going to get myself and my crew killed for nothing. But I thought, well, this guy is really hurt, and I think I made kind of a dumb comment when I came in. I said something about. I said, I can't see you, I can't hear you. If you don't, if we don't show yourself in about 10 seconds, I'm out of here.
And then I said it in a really stern voice.
And then I thought, how stupid. Here the guy is, half dead, really badly injured. We knew that, and here I'm, asking him to clamber through all this stuff. So I thought, well, I'm going to stay there. I'm going to stay and wait for him. But I was just about at the point where I thought, we've got to go. We're just going to get killed for nothing. And I think it was my crew chief looking out the right side that saw some movement in the out in the weeds. And Kenny he was on the other end of that. I probably tell what happened there. But let us know. But yeah, I was sitting in the hover for 4 minutes at that time.
I like it in the book. You're like, and if you don't think it's very long, count out the every second of the 4 minutes, and
right.
That'd be a long time to stay in one position, especially in the air like that.
Yeah, so, it seemed like kind of like an eternity, but why don't you tell them, Kenny, about what happened to you? You were on the other end when they saw you and you saw them, and you almost got yourself killed from our people way.
Yeah, when Dave first, they came up out of the valley, and I could hear this tremendous roaring helicopter. I mean, I knew the sound of the helicopter, and they kept asking me, do you see the helicopter yet? Pop your smoke. Do you see the helicopter yet? I only had one smoke flare. And they kept really pressuring me to pop this flare, and I kept saying, I can't see him yet. I could hear him. And then I could see 5 Sandy A1s weaving in a little circle in a tight group. And I knew that they were protecting the helicopter. So finally, I mean, what's the movie script is in this whole thing, I'm standing up, exposed to enemy fire, looking down this valley and looking for the helicopter. And suddenly, just like he's on an elevator, Dave pops up in his helicopter right in the midst of these right in the middle of these 5 A1s that are weaving around. And it's like, how are they avoiding a mid-air collision? You know, they were so tight. So Dave, I popped my smoke at that point. And this one smoke that I'd been protecting, they'd been wanting me to pop it for 3 days. Everybody wanted me to pop the smoke, and I'd saved it just for that moment. And I popped the smoke, and it was a fizzle. I mean, I got out about a 2-foot diameter bit of smoke, and I'm waving it, I'm blowing it, trying to get it to, and the wind is blowing it right along the ground, and I know he's not going to be able to see it. So anyway, bad luck. I end up having a bad flare. So I got out my little pin-like tracers, where these little shells that you could shoot from the end of a pencil-type device, and when they went off, they looked just like a Roman candle. I mean, literally brighter than a Roman candle. And so, thinking that Dave needed to see where I was, I shot 2 of these Roman candle devices right at him, asking him on the radio, or telling him on the radio I was going to do it, but the radio was pretty dead from the batteries, and he didn't hear that. So those 2 Roman candles went off, and the 5 Sandy A1s began to shoot at me. So I had rockets go right over the top of my head, and 20-millimeter bullets went racing by, and I thought, and I'm sitting there thinking, not any ill thoughts toward them, because I knew what they were thinking, but they literally almost killed me again a second time.
Well, and even once you got in the helicopter, you weren't out of the woods at that point, because at that point you'd gotten into the situation, into the valley. Then you had to get yourself back out again, and Dave, you were trying to get out, not get hit, and you had the people firing at you, and you also had the medic in the back working on Kenny. So what was that like?
Well, as soon as we got him on board, I poured the coals to it, and I thought, there's no way I'm going to fly all the way back down that valley. I'm just going to head for the ridge and pop up over the top. And we had a lot of incoming fire, and so I was jinking around, wiggling, and doing everything I could. And in the back, Kenny was pretty badly injured, and my PJ, my medic, was saying, fly straight and level, I got to operate in this guy, and if we fly straight and level, we're dead, So it was sort of a trade-off between the 2 things. And we started up the side of the ridge and kind of clawing for altitude and get up, and there was a gun position on top of the ridge, and then they started firing us, but they couldn't depress the barrel down to hit us, but we were going to fly right up into the path of their shells. I could see the tracers. So I whipped the helicopter off to the right and almost ran into a Sandy. It was just off my right, and I straightened myself back out, and he let loose 2 rockets, and they hit the gun position and blew up, and we were so close we flew through the debris cloud just getting over the top of the ridge.
Well, and at that point, as if you haven't had enough to deal with this day, then you're almost out of fuel again, right?
Yeah, that was funny.
We always bunched our drop tanks off when we went into hover, because we used the fuel from them first because they were heavy, and so I'd punched the drops off, and of course we'd been flying for quite a long time by the time all this took place, and so when I got out of the valley, then I discovered I didn't have enough fuel to get home, so we had to go hunt up a C-130 refueling bird and plug in and get some gas before we could make it all the way back.
Yeah, it was funny for me, Nicky, because I'm in the back. Initially I thought I was rescued and everything was swell, but then when the plane starts rocketing side to side and he's trying to avoid the gun emplacement, I'm thinking, oh man, I'm going to get shot down again. And about that time, somewhere in that position, after we went over to gun position, I sort of passed out. And this PJ, the paramedic who was manning one of the guns on the side of the aircraft, all of a sudden he's shaking my shoulder, and he's looking down at me with a big smile, and I thought it was one of those silly things, but I had to try to shake it off. But he says, hey, the pilot wants to know if you want to get up and watch him air refuel out of a C-130. I'm thinking, no, I just want to go home. I don't want any more of this stuff happening. I'm thinking. So I asked the guy, I said, has the pilot ever refueled in-flight refuel from a 130 before? Knowing that there is a currency level, you have to do it so often, every month or so to stay current and that type of stuff. My immediate fear was this helicopter pilot doesn't know how to refuel from a 130, and now we're going to have an in-flight mid-air with a C-130. But Dave pulled that off really well.
Yeah, we were talking about last week just how complicated that is to do it. I mean, I've seen the movies and it looks incredibly difficult, so I can just imagine in real life it's got to be even harder than it looks. And I got to tell the people listening, there is so much more detail in the books that y'all have not heard today. I want to make sure we didn't give too much information because obviously Kenny survived and Dave survived, so we know that you both made it back. There's just so much of the information in the detail about what happened, how it happened, the places where it happened, and something I mentioned last week is the maps that Dave has in the books to let you actually see where things were taking place. The notes I was reading about Kenny's book, there were so many areas where he gives you all sorts of details, details leading up to certain things, details about, the different sort of planes that were used, the missions that were flown, what it's like to actually take off and land on an Air Force aircraft carrier. There's just so many more details. Like I said, you knew going into this call that they both survived because we're both on the phone today, but there's so much more to both of their stories.
Yeah, in my book, Nikki, the most challenging part of the story for me was writing. I have two chapters on one of them, my wife getting bad news that I've been shot down. So She actually went through the same 30-hour period, and then one chapter on her getting the good news. And that was actually the most challenging part of the book, to try to write it, all the emotions, and interviewing the people, and all the emotions that went with the wives back at home waiting for this evolution to finish.
Right. Well, and y'all know what's going on because you're right there, but, the wives being back home, I'm sure they weren't getting nearly the updates to really know. And any kind of situation like that, your imagination is always, you're always imagining the worst of what's happening.
Yeah, it was really tough on the wives back then because we didn't have cell phones or satellite phones, and we would write a letter home, and of course you had to be careful what you said, and it'd be a couple of weeks before whoever you wrote to got it, and then another couple of weeks before you got anything back. So it was really tough on the people back home because they didn't really know what was going on, literally minute to minute, whether you were asleep or whether you were in danger or what, and it made it pretty tough on the wives.
Writing my book gave me a greater appreciation for my wife. As I was writing it, I thought she had to go for a 9-month period, day to day, worrying about me just making safe carrier landings after every mission, and then to then get hit with my being shot down on top of that, and then to live with it for 2 more combat deployments, every day, thinking this might be the day, and it gave me a greater appreciation for the family back at home, what they have to go through.
Well, the thing is, being shot down on your very first mission, too, every time you went up after that, she was going to be thinking about that sort of situation and that kind of thing. But I was reading an article in Newsweek last night about Cindy McCain talking about how she doesn't go anywhere. When her son was in Iraq, she didn't go anywhere without her cell phone because she was determined not to miss a call. If he had a chance to make a call, she was determined she was going to have that phone with her so she could talk to him, because once she spoke to him, she knew he was still okay. So, there are so many technological things that families have now that they didn't have in the late 60s. So you're right, it had to be hard not being as in touch and up to date about what the situation was and how the loved ones were doing at that point.
And from an author standpoint, I get the biggest pride when I get emails from readers telling me that they cried in this portion or that portion, and they laugh a lot and they and talk about. But when they talk about crying in certain portions of the book, from an author standpoint, I at least know I got the point home of what all the emotions were. And I've literally watched people read the first 5 pages of my book and tears roll down their eyes. And that's just in the first 5 pages.
Well, and something Dave mentioned last week was people that hadn't really dealt with or faced or talked about their time during the war, and by reading about his experiences, that's helped people to open up, which they needed to do. But it's been a way for them to to open up to family members and people that they need to talk about, their own experiences too. So it's always good when you share your own personal experiences, and I don't really get the feel, and I mean, I've read Dave's, and I don't get the feel from Kenny that either one of y'all's really goes into the political aspects of the war, as far as, what you felt about what was going on and whether you should have been there. None of that includes, and I actually had several people I talked to about Dave's tour who were concerned that maybe it was going to be, complaining about the government and this sort of thing, but it's not. It's purely about y'all's experiences, what happened, and that sort of thing. So none of the political aspect entered into it as far as I've seen.
No, I deliberately stayed. I've got a half a page in my prelude telling what was going on in 1968 to the country, but I deliberately stayed away from the political aspect because the point was we were military officers, military pilots being paid to do a job, and once our boss said, here's the job you're going to do for the next 9 months, we went out and did it without question. That doesn't mean that some pilots didn't question it, but I know that Dave and I didn't question it. We went over there and did the best we could. And then when you read Dave's book, the Vietnam Air Rescue book, bear in mind that Dave is very low-key, and a lot of stuff that he talks about in his book, even the things that I didn't know about myself, the other daily missions that he was doing, those were hairy missions and hairy stuff that he was doing. It took a lot of fortitude.
I would think for the two of y'all, reading each other's book would have been very interesting to see the other perspective of what was going on. Because, you lived one part of it, but to see what the other person in the opposite end of the spectrum basically was going through at the same time would have been very interesting.
Yeah, it was. And last summer, for the first time, 40 years later, my wife got to meet Dave.
Really?
And I got to meet Dave's wife, and that was the first time my wife had met him and had the opportunity to thank him for what he had done personally. So
that's cool. So, Kenny, you mentioned to me yesterday that you wanted me to ask you how you define a hero.
Yeah, I've given in my book presentations, I talk about the fact that Webster, if you go into Webster, there's 5 definitions of heroes, and I really didn't think even one where it talks about, in this case, military-type heroes actually did it justice, because it says a hero is someone who goes out and does an extraordinary, brave deed. But in this case, with Dave and the rescue pilots, I think there's one added thing that the hero is the person who understands the danger, goes home, sleeps overnight, understanding that danger, writes a letter to his wife saying, I may not make it back tomorrow, but I've got to go try to rescue this guy, goes out and does the mission knowing that he's probably going to get killed, and then makes the rescue. In other words, he knows ahead of time and has time to think about the danger. He recognizes the danger. If you go
as compared to the impulse kind of situation.
Right. If it's an impulse thing, you go up to a burning car out of impulse and you pull a person out. You didn't have time to see somebody else get burned trying to do that. In this case, Dave and the other guys, they've seen other guys get shot down, get killed, not come back, and this was a 3-day evolution. They had time to think about it, and they still but in my book, you'll read there are a couple of occasions, a couple of pilots who did not do that. They actually backed out. And so, to Dave's credit and the others who did it, some guys did back away from it, but the ones who thought about it thought it was still worth doing, and they went out and heroically did it.
Well, guys, I want to thank both of y'all for being with us today and sharing the information. It was interesting seeing the other side. Now that I've read Dave's book, and like I said, I read the summary of yours, so I knew the basics of what the chapter's about. But it's still great to hear both sides. Do you have any last minute thing you want to say, Dave?
No, I just appreciate being on today, and good talking to Kenny again. I wish you good luck in your book. I know you're doing fantastic as it is, but keep up the good work, guy.
Yeah, and I'd like the listeners to know that my book just was released in a softback paperback, full-size paperback, so it's available on Amazon, The Rescue of Streetcar 304.
On my show page, there is a link directly to Amazon to get more information about both of their books. So if you go to the link for today's show, you can get that information.
All right. I hope you really enjoyed the show. If you happen to miss the first show, and if you'd like to hear that, or if you'd like to hear both of them kind of back to back, you can go to my site. It's www.readyforloveradio.com and /Vietnam Air Rescues, and you'll find both of the interviews on the site. And I'll look forward to being with you next time on Ready for Love Radio.